Time to elevate. You're running on empty with Matt and Tony.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Running on Empty. I'm Matt.
And I'm Tony.
And we're running on empty. And this week, we've got a good one for you, man. Tony, why don't you give us a little rundown as to what this episode is all about?
Well, it's no secret that journalism is in crisis at pretty much every level, national and local. And today we have a real world practitioner of journalism, and he's going to share some insights about what he does and about the state of journalism generally.
Cool.
And why don't we invite our guest in? He is Miles Maguire. And Miles is the founder of and lead reporter for the Oshkosh Examiner, an online newspaper concerned with local facts that matter. Miles is a former professor of journalism at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, where he taught writing, editing, and reporting. He's authored a number of publications, including the 2014 book, Advanced Reporting, Essential Skills for 21st Century Journalism. He's worked as a beat writer, a columnist, a Washington bureau chief, a monthly magazine editor, and he's even published a fiction novel. And I give out Tony Awards every year in my column Media Rants, and Miles has won 4 consecutive Tony Awards. He's kind of like he's like the Bryan Cranston of Oshkosh. Remember Bryan Cranston winning all those awards?
Oh, God, yeah.
Yes. So thank you so much for being here, Miles. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's talk about the Oshkosh Examiner, which, by the way, people can go to at oshkoshexaminer.com. This started off as a blog. Is that right?
Yes. It started as a blog. And for a while, I was also made my copy available to a print newspaper here, the Oshkosh Herald. And the end of last year, I started making some changes. And then the beginning of this year, I put most of the content behind a paywall, just as kind of an experiment to see if there is enough interest in the community here to actually support this kind of journalism.
Well, what's the early verdict? Do you sense that there is enough support?
Well, the verdict is still up in the air. I would say that, so from January 1st to now, I've done very well. I've gotten a lot of subscribers who, put their credit card numbers down and paid either for a monthly or an annual subscription.
That's awesome.
But it needs to continue to grow. And,
right.
The pace of growth, not surprisingly, has slowed down. And there's some things that I have in mind to address that. But it's, it's paying for journalism, paying for content on the internet is still a relatively new thing. And
let me ask you about that. See, I personally have no problem subscribing to something like your publication, right? I know you. Your site is not flooded with advertisements, but would you not agree that the paywall model has really been a failure for the mainstream press in general? I mean, it works for the New York Times and the Washington Post, but I don't think it's worked for anyone else, has it?
Well, that's kind of the $1 million question right now, whether that will work or not. And it has worked in a few other instances, but it's a totally different mindset because when I was a print journalist, for example, at the companies that I worked at, by and large, the issue was advertising. And, the editorial department was, we were just an expense, something to be tolerated. What was important was keeping advertisers happy and keeping them writing the big checks. So to go from that thinking where, the editorial is basically just free. I mean, you used to be able to buy a newspaper for, 25 cents or whatever on the street. to a place where the journalism has to be good enough for people to pay for, that's a big leap. It's a big shift. And, honestly, most of the journalism isn't worth paying for. And so
I was going to say, a lot of the stuff that I've seen out there, they want you to subscribe, and I'm going, it's really not, I wouldn't waste money on that. Like, I do subscribe to New York Times and Wall Street Journal. So using like what's going on in like Australia? Because I mean, I know that Facebook had to just dump a load of money into over to Rupert Murdoch. So what is that about the same thing, or is that something completely different?
Well, that's, the way that content gets distributed now is either through Facebook or Google. And aside from Australia, those two platforms don't pay for content. That's part of their shtick, is that, we're not publishers, we're just platforms. So, you can't sue us because we're not responsible for any of this stuff. We don't pay for it. We just scoop it all up and then sell advertising against it. So that is, that's where we are, and that's kind of the worst of all worlds. So, yeah.
Do you think that what you're doing is the model that we will see more of going forward, where you're pretty much a one-man operation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's a stretch to do it, even in this community, which is relatively small. In larger communities, it's not doable. You do need more people at it. But there are a lot of communities like Oshkosh or smaller, and these are sometimes called news deserts, sort of like food deserts. Right. And there's been a fair amount of research into this. I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but there are a lot of communities across the country, either rural communities or small town communities, where there was a newspaper, probably a weekly, that could gather enough advertising, probably didn't have subscriptions, it probably was delivered by mail or, by hand for free. And they've gone out of business because advertisers have found that it's, even at the local level, or maybe especially at the local level, it is so much cheaper and more effective to advertise on Facebook, for example, or to advertise on Google, because it's inexpensive. You have more control over it. You can target, down to very, very specific demographic and geographical aspects. Or, you don't even necessarily have to advertise. If you have a Facebook page and you can develop a following among the local community, you can just post, if you're a restaurant, this is our menu today, or your club, this is the band that's going to play tonight, and come on down.
So let me ask you this question. Now that you are putting your content behind a paywall, are you feeling more pressure to do quote unquote sensational stories? I know that one of your stories that got some criticism was the one you did about a local school board member who allegedly had an affair with the CEO of the Oshkosh Truck Corporation. And in your report on that, you put in a lot of language from the school board member's police report, which had some, I guess, what we might call salacious details. What would you say to your critics who might say that seemed like a tabloidish kind of story?
I guess I would say that a couple things. One, I would acknowledge that there were some aspects of it that I wish weren't true and could have been avoided. But the story, the story was not unknown, in certain circles in the community. It was not known generally. And
but I mean, if let me ask it this way: if a school board member, or a city council member, or a county board member is having an extramarital affair with a prominent person in the community, is that like news?
No, in and of itself, it's not necessarily, but in this case, the situation, which has not been denied by either party. So I think there's substantial truth to it. Involved arguably the most powerful person in the community and a member of an entity that was struggling to carry out its responsibilities and was not carrying them out very well. And so, under the circumstances, I thought that this was an important piece of information. But I don't like those kinds of stories, and I didn't publish it as clickbait.
Yeah, I guess that really was my question. As you've put your news behind a paywall, do you feel more pressure to create clickbait type of stories? And you're saying no.
No, I don't. And I think that I can say unequivocally, I would have preferred not to publish that story because I knew that some people in the community would not be happy with it.
Mm-hmm.
But the same thing with the story I published today about the chancellor and his involvement in a previous job in something that's arguably racist. The chancellor is a very charming guy who has a lot of friendships in the community. Mm-hmm. And it would be easier not to publish that story, but at a time of racial reckoning and given what he has done on campus, I just thought that was information, broader.
Yeah, just let me set this up for our audience. So our chancellor, Dr. Andrew Levitt, last year had decided that the name Frederick March would come off the Frederick March Theater. Frederick March, the actor, when he was a young man, had been in some kind of Ku Klux Klan organization. This has been controversial for years. His family claims that he was actually a great civil rights activist. Although in 1970, I don't think when they named it after Frederick March, they did it because of his civil rights activism. At the time, he was a white guy from Wisconsin, right, who had had success as an Academy Award winner. But
the two things there too. One, he wasn't a member of the Ku Klux Klan. He was the member of an honorary society that at one point used the KKK as its name, but was never affiliated with them. And then as an actor and a professional, he was extremely active in the civil rights movement.
But that's not why they put his name on that building.
Oh, absolutely not. And I think that's a real failure, because I think for all the years that I was on campus, I never knew who Frederick March was.
Well, when I was chair of the Department of Comm Studies, theater was part of our department, and I could never get a clear answer as to, nothing against Frederick March, but why was the theater named for him in the first place?
Yeah.
Right. And so, in other words, there would have been good reasons to rename that theater independently of whatever club he might have belonged to as a young person. But the point is, so now we have the chancellor who took the name off the theater, who you now found evidence that when he was raising money at the University of Northern Georgia?
Yeah, North Georgia. Yeah.
North Georgia. One of the organizations he raised money from was a group that was called, what was the name of the group?
Well, he raised money for the Blue Ridge Rifles.
The Blue Ridge Rifles, which is a pro-Confederacy group.
Well, it's a student group, but its name harkens back to a unit of Confederate soldiers who signed up in 1861 And when their enlistments were up in 1864 and the tide of battle was turning against the Confederacy, they re-upped and they continued to fight. And they're the larger unit that they were in fought all the way to the end to Appomattox Courthouse and were part of the surrender that Robert E. Lee handed in.
So they were the true believers.
I think so.
So, but I mean, when I encourage people to go to OshkoshExaminer.com and read the story, but was your point in the story of bringing out the Frederick March action, are you trying to suggest that the chancellor is a hypocrite?
I'm trying to suggest that the situation we're in is problematic and difficult, and it has layers to it. And if taking Frederick March's name off the theater was the right thing to do because of some small thing to do with his past, then how do we evaluate people who are in positions of power today who have something similar in their past? And I don't have the answer to that. And I think, as you were mentioning, we never knew what Frederick March's connection was to UW Oshkosh. And I think that was a missed opportunity because he really was a hero of the civil rights movement. And that would have been great to know. I wish I had known that when I was teaching there.
This sounds kind of like like an extension of the cancel culture. I mean, it's happening all over the place. So this is just like the next domino to fall,
Yeah, and I think that's the canceling is an extreme step, and I think that what we need to do is to be more cognizant that humans are complicated beings, and we're not all good or all bad, but we deserve.
And it doesn't even sound like the reason of canceling it. It doesn't even sound like the story's completely straight because it sounds like he's done a lot more positive than negative.
Yes.
So without really like a thorough investigation, it sounds like, okay, well, we're going to remove this. But, I've seen this in so many things, and I kind of find it annoying. Why hold, somebody accountable? I mean, granted, what they did, was it great? Necessarily? No, but I mean, take a look at our Supreme Court right now. We've got Kavanaugh in there who, I thought it was pretty much a blatant lie when he talked about, okay, it was a drinking game, whatever they were playing there, but he's a Supreme Court justice now. We haven't canceled him. But it seems like, when it comes to certain groups, it just is easier to do.
Yeah.
So I want to go into a question. So when it comes to having articles on your site, do you have like a set of metrics, like this is going to make for a good article? Like it has to, may have these criteria in order to be an article on the site?
Well, I think one of the answer is yes, but what I'm trying to do is to go against the flow of the idea that news exists, in the moment. In other words, it's more of a long-term project. The idea behind the Oshkosh Examiner is, and I think this is a lofty and maybe unachievable goal, but the goal is to produce a more educated citizenry.
Yeah.
Sure. So I pick articles that I think will inform people about things that they didn't already know. Tell me something I didn't already know. That's really what I'm going for. Now, in a lot of cases, that is going to produce oh my God, I didn't know that. Right. Let me share the story on Facebook, and I'm not opposed to that. But I'll also write a story about a budget process, or a very numbers heavy story that I know is going to close some eyelids, but some people will read it, and I think that it's important for people to know that.
And you're trying to hold local leaders accountable, right? So I saw a 2019 study by the Knight Foundation it found that 60% of Americans believe that the local media do a fair or poor job of holding leaders accountable for their actions. Do you share that the mainstream press do a poor job of holding leaders accountable?
Yes.
All right.
And I think that the danger is that it's been going on for so long that there are people who feel that, nobody's watching. I can do what I want. And, and it's a slippery slope when you have people who are in positions of authority and they're not spending their own money, they're spending taxpayers' money. Sometimes there are, things that they think that they're deserved. For example, a story that I did back in the Examiner's blog days involved the county coroner, Barry Busby, who, was the most popular elected official in the county. But it turns out that he was mailing it in, literally, or phoning it in. He was doing his job from out of state, and that he was relying on his deputies, and that there was more going on. That there was apparently a pattern of sexual, not necessarily, well, maybe sexual assault, or certainly sexual intimidation. But the way that he was perceived in the press is that he was a great guy because he got heavily involved in suicide prevention and overdose prevention, and he was really looking at some really serious problems in the community. And people thought very highly of him, and his press was great. He was a great guy. But there was another aspect that he was, taking money from the county and not doing his job. And when these facts came out, ultimately he resigned his position.
So what is it about?
Decided that,
right.
Go ahead.
So what is it about, say, most of the major newspapers now in Wisconsin are owned by the Gannett Corporation. They have a lot more resources than you have, right?
Yep.
So how is it that the Gannett Corporation, with all of its resources, cannot hold officials accountable?
Because that's not what they're trying to do. The story, the Barry Busby story, was actually available to the local Gannett paper before I was made aware of it. And I was made aware of it because someone in the community was aware that Gannett knew this information, but said, we're understaffed. And we'll get to it when we get to it, but there's nothing we can do. And so they could have done it, but I think what their reporters and editors do, and their staffs are much smaller than they were, but they have this whole digital strategy about posting things on Facebook and driving traffic. And that's time consuming. But that's not what I'm doing. I wish I had more traffic, but
it's the get rich slowly scheme, and it seems to be working well.
Well,
yeah,
after you appear on Running MT, your traffic will greatly increase. But
sure.
yeah. But another example. We have a school superintendent in Oshkosh, Dr. Vicki Cartwright, who just announced that she is resigning, effective, I think, the end of June. Do you think that your reporting had anything to do with that? You've done a number of stories on the school district.
Yes. And, and again, here's an example where Dr. Cartwright was very well liked by some leading members of the community. And in fact, after my reporting started, somebody commented to me, one of my subscribers, that, I think Dr. Cartwright's getting, unfair treatment. I think that she's better than what's going on. But I do think that my reporting did have an effect, one of the things that I reported, I think that probably really broke the dam, was that there was deep unhappiness among the principals, the people who actually run the schools, and that they felt that they had been cut off from the school board and from the central administration. And so, yeah, sure, that was a screamer story.
What would you say to people? What would you say to people, Miles, who might say that story about the principal's dissatisfaction with Dr. Cartwright is really a story of sexism in public life, in that she, as a woman in that position, was put under a microscope that very few of her male predecessors were put under? And when you look at it on a surface level, she had some great successes, right? She got some referenda passed. They did some progress on their strategic planning. I mean, I don't agree with a lot of what the school board does. All right. But what would you say to the argument that there was some sexism in all of this?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that education is a field where there's a very large female presence, and that some of Dr. Cartwright's biggest critics were other women.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that she got more scrutiny is, I think it's a historical accident. If I had been doing this under a previous superintendent and something similar had happened, I would have written the same story.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So let me ask you about a more national issue. I think it's widely accepted that in the Trump years, journalism really failed, right? And I would argue that it failed like dramatically, an epic fail, right? Every day reporting on tweets, right? Treating the Trump administration like it was somehow just another Republican administration that maybe just had an eccentric guy at the top. I mean, I don't think it was just another Republican administration. That was something very, very new in American politics.
I thought it was exhausting personally, but
yeah. And I think a lot of it was used for clickbait, right? I mean, I think it was was it the CBS chair? Was it Les Moonves who said that Donald Trump is good for business or something like that? So, I mean, A, do you agree that journalism largely failed in the Trump era? And B, do you see anything different going forward?
Well, I definitely think that there is a failure here, but I think that the failure is actually deeper, because I think a term that is behind your question a little bit is the idea of a mainstream press, right? The mainstream press failed to to behave properly and to actually respond to this strange phenomenon of Donald Trump. And the question that I have is, where is the mainstream press? What is the mainstream press? And I don't think that there is a mainstream press. We have this deeply divided country that, is roughly, 50-50 roughly. And I don't know of any news entity that really bridges both groups, that both groups say, oh, I've turned to this XYZ news outlet because I think they understand who I am and are looking out for my interests. You have some groups, one group looks to one group of publications or news outlets, networks, and the other group looks to another one. And so, and that's really hard. One of the challenges that's faced journalism, the profession, for decades is its failure to diversify. And that's usually presented as a failure to hire women, to a failure to hire and promote Black, Asian, Hispanic. And that's true. And I think that's one of the, it's really turned into a market failure, because I think that's one of the reasons why circulation has gone down. But there also is not a diversification of political viewpoints. And it's not enough to do, what the New York Times has tried to do, which is to hire a couple of conservative columnists. You actually have to bring people into your newsroom who have different points of view, different ways of looking at things. And that's it's hard to do, because, in any organization, you want teamwork, you want unity, you want people, all pulling in the same direction. But people have different values. All of the newspapers that I worked at, and any other news entity, said on the surface, we want to recruit more Blacks, we want to recruit more women. But they never got very far, because the environment in the newsroom, you could hire a Black reporter, you could, appoint a Black editor, at some mid-level position with the idea that this person would rise up. But they got washed out of the newsroom because it was not a welcoming place. They were hired, on the one hand, to bring a different perspective on the news, but then if they expressed that different perspective, they got pushback that, oh no, well, that's not really, you don't really understand what we're doing here. So that's a real challenge, and and there's not an easy answer to it.
No.
I just miss straight reporting. I mean, everybody's got an idea or an opinion or a spin, and going back to the Walter Cronkites, here's what happened, here's what's happening, here's what might happen. And that was it. There was most of the news today, and they should literally have to remove the word news, because it's all opinionated. It's all whataboutism. It's not actually about what you think it's going to be about. It's going to completely change in a bunch of talking heads. I just want to hear a story about something and then have me make up my own mind as to, what I think about that, and not, there's so much pressure to believe a certain way, which is why I don't actually watch a lot of news. I enjoy reading a newspaper, like a physical newspaper. I really do. There is typically when I can see just objective stories for the most part. I don't think we're going to fix that anytime soon. I think we're definitely in a court of public opinion all the time. So is there, in your opinion, do you think that news stations can go back to something like that, or news outlets can go back to something like that, or are we too far gone?
I hope that we can get back to it, but in any story, people are going to say, you go back to the school board CEO story that I wrote, some people are going to say, oh, that's, that wasn't just the facts, that those were selectively chosen facts. And the part of the problem is that the reporting process is a matter of making choices. And selecting certain facts that you think, or prioritizing certain facts that you think are most important. So, and unfortunately, the way that I can prove that I am, middle of the road, straight down the middle kind of guy, is by writing stories that offend people across the spectrum.
An equal opportunity offender.
Yeah. And not that I set out to do that, but I think people actually find me more credible. I mean, there are people who would say, well, Miles, he worked at the university. He's a university professor, so he's not going to write anything bad about UW Oshkosh. You can't trust him when he's reporting there. He's talking about some new construction project that's going to improve the school, so that's sort of that bias that he's pushing that. But then gotcha. I write a story about the chancellor and they say, well, maybe he's willing to put it out there and let people make their own decisions. So at least that's what I hope is happening.
Miles, we are just about out of time, and just one last question. You talked about the Oshkosh Examiner being a long-term project. If you do get, ideal scenario, let's say you get a sufficient number of subscribers, would you actually consider hiring a journalist? to work with
Yeah, I mean, there absolutely is more news here to cover
you? Yeah.
than I can cover. And I feel like I've just scratched the surface. And that, that's one of the reasons why, some of these screamer stories are available, because there hasn't been enough reporting in the community for an extended period of time. And so, yeah, I would love to hire more people.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well,
Well,
thank
we
you
love
so
what you
much
do.
for being here with us today. Go ahead, Matt. I'm sorry.
No, I said we love what you do, and keep doing what you do, because I think people need to
Well,
hear
thank
it. Absolutely.
Yeah, once again, everyone should go to OshkoshExaminer.com. Check out what Miles has to offer, and consider subscribing. It's really not that expensive to subscribe for a year. I think it's like $50 a year. Is that right?
$50 a year, or it comes down when you work it down to a week. It's less than a glass of beer. So if you're going to drink a beer this week, you can subscribe to the Oshkosh Examiner.
Hey, seriously, go order Tapper Night. You buy 4 of those, you could have some actually really good information.
I'm not sure if that's the best pitch for Wisconsin, right? Like, no, I'm not going to give up my 1 extra beer for this. You should have said the cost of a latte, right? Or something like that. Yeah. All right. Thank you, Miles. We appreciate it.
Thanks so
Sure.
much, Miles.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Talk to you again soon.
Okay. Sounds good. Take care.
Bye. Yeah.
Take
Bye.
care.
Hey, Matt, that was really a spectacular interview.
Oh man, I had a lot of fun with that. I learned a lot too. That's one of my favorite parts about the show, is that every single one that we do, I'm always learning something. I'm always the eternal student, if you will.
Yeah. Well, you know what I love about Miles is that rather than just sit back and critique national or local journalism, he's actually doing something.
Yeah.
I mean, he's providing a really good role model of what journalism can be. So I really do encourage people to go to OshkoshExaminer.com. And I mean, obviously the guy's been a journalism professor, a real world journalist for many years. So
yeah,
he knows what he's doing.
Absolutely.
And, I like to think that if every city the size of Oshkosh and larger had something like the Oshkosh Examiner, we would have a much, much different journalism environment in this country.
I think so. I think we need a lot more of what he does. We need a lot more folks like Miles out there. So I'm very appreciative that he's out there doing what he does. And really, he does hold true to the facts that matter.
Yeah.
Very much so. So
absolutely.
Awesome. Well, that wraps it up for this week, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in. Remember to like and subscribe. If you have any questions, you can send them to runningonempty2020@gmail.com. And we'll have something awesome planned for you for the next one. So stay tuned, stay subscribed. And Tony, we'll see everybody next time. Stay elevated, everybody.
Yeah, everyone stay elevated.
Running on Empty with Matt and Tony.
Are you already catching flack about that story about the chancellor?
No. Should I?